What happened to Spain?
Just a few years ago, Spain was the dream of many Europeans, but today, life in this country is becoming increasingly unbearable. In 2014, a square meter of housing in Madrid cost less than 3,000 euros. Today, it's nearly 5,000 euros. We're talking about a classic housing and cost of living crisis. But that's not the whole story. There's also another crisis, a pretty unique one, a tourism crisis. It's not just about a few extra hotels. Locals say they're overloaded and tourism is literally destroying their cities. In 2024, Spain was visited by 94 million people, including nearly 15 million in Barcelona alone. By the way, that's almost 10 times the city's population. Because of this, in the summer of 2025, thousands of Spaniards took to the streets, not to protest against their government or any laws at all, but against mass tourism.
Any place in the planet don't want this kind of tourist, this predator, okay, tourists, because destroy. They say, oh, we will do a big hotel and all the people here have work in the future. Washing dish. This is not good for the population, this is not good for the islands.
To understand today's crisis, we have to go back a few decades, to the time when Spain was ruled by General Franco. In the 1950s, Spain was still largely an agricultural country. Poverty was widespread in the countryside. A lot of people dreamed of moving to the big cities, where jobs and wages were better, but Franco himself simply didn't want that. He feared that large concentrations of people in urban centers could become breeding grounds for political unrest, so he introduced a permit system for relocation. In practice, hundreds of thousands of people were trapped in rural poverty with barely any prospects. By the 1960s, however, the regime had to ease its grip. Social pressure and the need for industrial labor were simply overwhelming. That was when the permit system was abolished, and what followed was the largest internal migration in Spain's history. Nearly 10 million people changed their place of residence. Out of a total population of just 32 million, that meant 1 in 3 Spaniards decided to move. To handle this influx, Franco ordered the mass construction of cheap housing in metropolitan areas. Those were basic and cramped, but at least affordable. As a result, the share of homeowners in the country rose from 45% in 1950 to 70% in 1970. In Barcelona, it was even more impactful. Only 5% of families owned their homes in 1950, but by 1970, that number had reached 38%. From that moment on, housing stopped being seen as a service in the traditional sense. It came to be viewed as a capital investment. Banks supported this model with mortgages, and politicians encouraged home ownership as the foundation of social stability. This mentality, inherited from the Franco era, would go on to shape the housing market for decades. The 1980s were a time of major transformation for Spain. Industry declined and factories shut down, which led to record unemployment levels, reaching as high as 20%. The country, striving to catch up with the West, needed a new economic anchor. Then came 1992. Barcelona hosted the Summer Olympics, which marked a turning point for the city and the nation alike. The Olympic Games opened the door to a complete urban overhaul and became Spain's biggest image investment in decades. Transport networks were redesigned, old neighborhoods were renewed, and industrial zones turned into leisure districts. The city was rebuilt, not to serve its residents, but to accommodate foreign visitors instead. That was the moment Spain realized its future no longer lay in factories, but in beaches and hotels. Not long after, tourism began to grow at a pace the country had never experienced before. But that success came with a dark side, because when your entire economy depends on tourism, you become a hostage to the vacation season. Nevertheless, as long as the system held up, no one worried. At the start of the 21st century, Spain went through a construction frenzy. In 2006 alone, over 700,000 new homes were built in a single year. That's more than in Germany, France, and Italy combined. At first glance, you might think it was an economic miracle. Spain, indeed, was growing faster than most of Europe. The construction sector made up over 12% of GDP and accounted for a quarter of all new jobs. But in reality, it was a debt-fueled bubble built on speculation. Small towns often ended up with thousands of new housing units built with no clear purpose, while Madrid and Barcelona still lacked affordable rentals. And then in 2008, the bubble burst. Banks collapsed, and hundreds of thousands of people lost their jobs. Unemployment jumped from 8% to a record 26% by 2013, which basically means 1 in 4 working-age Spaniards had no job. On top of that, over 1.5 million homes were left empty and unsold, with some housing complexes turning into ghost towns. Thousands of families were forced to default on their mortgages, and banks seized their homes. That's how the so-called mortgage generation was born. Young adults paying off homes whose market value had dropped by half. It was the worst social crisis since the dictatorship, and at the same time, a turning point, because the country that had been developing housing units at full speed now had to look for a new lifeline, and that lifeline turned out to be tourism. In 2013, the government changed short-term rental regulations. It was a green light for platforms like Airbnb. Within just a few years, entire neighborhoods of Barcelona and Madrid began to transform. Buildings that once housed families became vacation apartments. As a result, by 2019, Barcelona alone had more than 18,000 active Airbnb listings. That was more than the city's entire stock of public housing. At the same time, house prices started to rise rapidly. When an owner can rent an apartment to a family for 900 euros a month or earn the same amount from tourists in just a few nights, the choice is obvious. And here's an interesting paradox. Spain today has around 3.8 million vacant homes, about 14% of its entire housing stock. Even in overcrowded Barcelona, nearly 9% of dwellings are empty. That's the irony of the Spanish crisis. People from all over the world buy homes here, but visit them only for short vacations. That's one of the main reasons why the walls of Barcelona are increasingly covered with anti-tourism graffiti.
Tengan un turismo sostenible que permita también vivir la gente que pueda vivir del turismo, pero que permita un turismo sostenible que no impida que los vecinos hagan su vida normal en los barrios.
And when you look closer at Spanish society, things get even worse. Spain now faces one of the most severe generational crises in Europe. Over the past few decades, average wages have barely risen at all. That sounds bad enough, but it looks even grimmer when you compare it to housing prices, which have skyrocketed over the same period. In Madrid or Barcelona, renting a small apartment now consumes more than half of an average salary. That means that after paying rent, there's not a lot left, neither enough for a family nor for the future. In Germany or Austria, rent takes up around 30% of income. In Spain, it's often as much as 50%. More and more young Spaniards, especially those living in major cities, simply never move out. 65% of young Spaniards still live with their parents. That's one of the highest rates in the entire European Union. That directly leads to collapsing birth rates. Spain now has one of the lowest fertility rates in Europe, only around 1.2 children per woman. This means the population is shrinking and aging at record speed. It's much more common in big cities, but rural areas are also showing signs of this crisis. It's possible for a village to simply empty out because entire regions lose their inhabitants. In some provinces, like Castile and Leon, over 70% of municipalities now have fewer than 1,000 residents. Those with ambition and energy leave for major cities or move abroad altogether, to Germany or France, for example. In Spain today, the housing crisis collides with the demographic one, and in the long run, it spells even greater trouble for Spaniards.
Lamento tener que comparecer en estas circunstancias, pero nadie, y digo nadie, que tenga un mínimo de aprecio a nuestro país, puede ignorar el estado de putrefacción al que nos tiene sometido el actual gobierno. La degradación es total. Ha llegado el momento de que la mayoría de los españoles decentes entendamos y reaccionemos ante lo que está en juego.
For years, the authorities pretended the problem would solve itself. Eventually, public pressure grew so great that the state had to act. In 2023, Spain passed the Ley de Vivienda, the new housing law. It introduced new regulations for rents in so-called stressed areas, imposed rent caps, and created a tax on empty properties to push owners to rent out unused apartments while they're not living there. In theory, these rules make a lot of sense for locals. However, in practice, implementation has been slow and buried under bureaucracy. On top of that, landlords keep finding loopholes and prices continue to rise despite new laws. The main problem is that some regulations are having the opposite of their intended effect. Owners aware of new rent regulations often prefer to sell their apartments or list them on Airbnb, where oversight remains weak to this day. As a result, the number of long-term rentals drops and competition among tenants pushes prices even higher. We've seen similar stories elsewhere in Europe. In Berlin, after rent caps were introduced in 2020, many landlords pulled their flats from the market, and rents for legal listings actually rose faster once the law was repealed. Spain now risks repeating that scenario. Barcelona decided to go even further. In 2024, the city announced the mass elimination of tourist apartments by 2028. And here's the key question. Does the state truly control the housing market or merely make rules without proper planning, which only deepens the crisis? On top of soaring prices, there's another often overlooked problem. Spain has some of the strictest tenant protection laws in Europe. That might sound good, but it's often abused to its limits by dishonest tenants. In such cases, evictions can drag on for months, even years. And it's not a new issue. Already in the 1990s, such cases were common and could take over a year to resolve. And after the 2008 crisis, the problem became even more severe. Thousands of families stopped paying mortgages or rent, and the anti-desahucio movement blocked bailiffs. Every government since has promised reform, but the system barely changed. In 2023, there were over 38,000 eviction cases nationwide. In Barcelona and Madrid, some families occupied homes for up to 2 years without paying rent, while the owner still had to cover mortgages and bills. Then there's the phenomenon of ocupas, illegal squatters living in properties while they are empty. According to court data, police recorded more than 16,000 such cases in 2022 alone, most of them in Catalonia, long considered Europe's squatter capital. All of this drives many landlords to abandon long-term rentals altogether. They find it easier and overall more profitable to list their flats on Airbnb. They get paid up front and avoid the risk of a tenant they can't evict for months. The result is that the rental market shrinks even further and the housing crisis deepens.
Let's talk about Spain. The economy has been growing faster than most of its neighbours recently, and that's in great part due to its tourism industry, which contributes around 13% of GDP growth and once again is breaking records. But not everyone is happy about the growth of tourism in Spain, which is now seeing a backlash in many parts of the country.
But beyond problematic tenants and soaring rents, there's a deeper issue. For years, Spain has built its economy on tourism and real estate, which has turned homes from places to live and raised families into financial assets for international investors. Foreign funds now buy up entire blocks of properties. Large corporations treat Spanish apartment buildings like stock portfolios, things they buy low and sell for profit later on. That means ordinary Spaniards aren't competing with other locals anymore. They're up against the global capital. And unfortunately, the problem doesn't stop with housing. Foreign firms are also taking over key sectors, like energy, insurance, or banking. Decisions about prices and investments are increasingly made in London, Frankfurt, or New York, not in Madrid or Barcelona. As a result, Spain is losing not only control over its housing market, but also its ability to shape its own economy in the years ahead. And that's the greatest danger of all, because if a nation no longer decides its own future, who will? Even the government admits the situation is dire. In 2025, it proposed a 100% tax on property purchases by non-EU residents who don't live in Spain. That's another measure meant to discourage foreign investments that drive up prices. But as of this day, the law remains only a proposal, raising serious questions about its legality and effectiveness. Yet still, the fact that politicians are considering such drastic steps shows just how deep the crisis has become. Because today, Spain has become a living paradox. It's a stunning paradise with amazing weather, but it's increasingly being shaped for tourists. Spaniards themselves see their own country more and more as a daily struggle, torn apart by foreign investment and mass tourism. A very similar scenario is now unfolding in Greece. You can learn more about it in the video currently displayed on your screen.